9 signs your brain is releasing control. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much. It's quieter than that. It settles in on a random Tuesday when nothing particularly bad happened, and yet something in you just stops fighting. You let the email sit. You don't rehearse the conversation you've been dreading. You cancel the plan you spent a week overanalyzing, and instead of feeling guilty, you feel something close to relief. Not happiness, just stillness, like a machine that finally stopped running in the background. Most people around you wouldn't even notice. You show up, you function, you say the right things, but internally something has shifted. The grip has loosened, and you're not entirely sure whether to be frightened by that or grateful. People who haven't been through it tend to call this giving up. They see the withdrawal and assume defeat. They see the stillness and assume indifference. What they miss, what almost everyone misses, is that what looks like surrender from the outside is sometimes the most sophisticated thing a nervous system can do. It isn't weakness, it's a pattern, and it has a name. What you're experiencing are signs that your brain is releasing control, not breaking down, not giving up, but genuinely, neurologically letting go of the constant effort to manage outcomes it was never meant to manage in the first place. And there's far more going on beneath the surface than most people ever get to understand. The human brain is, at its core, a prediction machine. This is not a metaphor. Neuroscientists describe it precisely this way. Your brain doesn't passively receive reality, it actively constructs it, generating moment-to-moment predictions about what is about to happen, and then comparing those predictions against what actually does. The goal, biologically speaking, is to minimize surprise, to keep the future legible. And for many people, particularly those whose early environments were unpredictable, emotionally inconsistent, or quietly unsafe, the brain learned to turn this prediction function up very, very high. Control, in this context, is not a personality trait, it's a nervous system adaptation. When a child grows up not knowing which version of a parent will walk through the door, or learns that emotional safety depends on reading the room perfectly, the brain recalibrates. It begins dedicating enormous resources to anticipating outcomes, managing perceptions, staying one step ahead of chaos. By adulthood, this process runs so automatically that most people don't even register it as effort. It just feels like being responsible, being thorough, caring. But effort is still effort, even when it's invisible. And the brain, after years or decades of maintaining that level of vigilance, eventually begins doing something remarkable. It starts to release. The first sign is often the hardest to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it. There's a moment, or a slow accumulation of moments, where the urge to fix things simply doesn't arrive on schedule. You notice a problem, register it clearly, and then nothing. No rush of anxiety, no mental sprint towards solutions, just a flat, almost puzzled awareness that the problem exists. Psychologists would recognize this as a reduction in what's called compulsive coping. The behavior that once felt urgent has lost its charge. The brain has begun reassessing whether the energy expenditure is actually worth it. The second sign shows up in how you handle other people's emotions. For most of your life, someone else's bad mood may have felt like your problem to solve. When a friend went quiet, your nervous system read it as a threat. You'd adjust, accommodate, probe gently, work to restore the equilibrium. When the brain begins releasing control, that reflex dulls. You notice the discomfort in the room, and you let it be the room's problem. Not because you've become cold, but because some deep, unspoken part of you has finally understood the difference between empathy and emotional labor you were never asked to perform. The third sign is a changed relationship with being misunderstood. Previously, a misread text or an ambiguous conversation could spiral into hours of mental reconstruction, replaying what you said, imagining what they meant, rehearsing what you'd say to clarify. When the brain is releasing control, the spiral simply doesn't complete. You let the ambiguity exist. Something in you has accepted that not every perception of you is yours to correct, and not every silence is yours to explain. The fourth sign is that silence itself stops feeling dangerous. Many people who have lived with high-control nervous systems develop a complicated relationship with stillness. In a quiet room, the mind fills the space. When the brain begins to let go, silence becomes something you can actually inhabit. This is neurologically significant. The default mode network, the brain's resting state circuitry, becomes less hyperactive. The quiet is no longer a void that needs to be managed. The fifth sign is a change in how you correct the future gets shorter. Not pessimistic, just closer. You stop making elaborate contingency plans for things that haven't happened yet. You stop pre-grieving scenarios that exist only in your imagination. Your thinking begins to sit more naturally in the present tense. This isn't dissociation or numbness. It's actually a marker of nervous system regulation. Research on interoceptive awareness suggests that as people become more attuned to present-moment bodily experience, their tendency toward future-oriented rumination genuinely decreases. The sixth sign can feel alarming until you understand it. Some things that used to matter stop mattering as much. Not your core values, those tend to sharpen, but the peripheral urgencies, the need to be perceived a certain way, the anxiety about what someone thinks of your opinion, the compulsion to have the right answer. When the brain releases control, it undergoes a kind of pruning, dropping the survival-level importance that got attached to things that were never actually survival-level threats. What remains feels more real, even if it's quieter. The seventh sign is a change in how conflict registers in the body. Previously, even the anticipation of disagreement could trigger a full physiological response, the tight chest, the mental rehearsal, the adrenaline that lingers for hours. As the brain releases control, the window of tolerance expands. You can hold a difficult conversation without your whole system treating it like an emergency. Polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, describes this shift as movement towards a more integrated social engagement system, one that doesn't immediately recruit fight or flight responses to navigate interpersonal friction. The eighth sign is probably the most surprising. Letting go of control doesn't make you less capable. It often makes you more decisive. This is the paradox that almost nobody warns you about. The hypervigilant brain, for all its effort, is actually inefficient at decisions. When every option is being assessed for potential threat, genuine preferences get buried under layers of risk analysis. When the grip loosens, something cleaner surfaces. You find yourself choosing more quickly, more honestly, more in line with what you actually want rather than what seems safest. The ninth sign is a quiet but unmistakable shift in what you're willing to carry. You begin, almost without deciding to, returning things that were never yours, the guilt that belonged to someone else's choices, the anxiety that was borrowed from an environment you no longer live in, the responsibility for outcomes that exist beyond the edge of any reasonable personal influence. The brain, in letting go of control, is completing a kind of long-delayed audit, recognizing what was adaptive once and no longer needs to be hauled forward. None of this is a prescription. Some people feel more at home in high structure and close attention to outcomes, and there's nothing wrong with that. The brain's inclination towards control isn't a defect in need of correction. It was, in its original context, genuinely useful. It kept things together when things needed to be held. But for people who recognize themselves in what's been described here, there's something important to name. What you're experiencing isn't collapse, it's recalibration. The exhaustion that comes just before the releasing, the strange flatness that follows, the disorientation of not performing vigilance anymore, these are not signs that something has broken. They're signs that something has finally understood it doesn't have to keep working that hard. You are not less, you are not dissolving. You are, in the most literal neurological sense, teaching your nervous system what safety feels like from the inside rather than from the outside in. That is not a small thing. That's one of the harder things a person can do, and most of them do it without any fanfare, without anyone noticing, and without fully understanding what's happening to them while it's happening. The releasing is quiet. It looks like nothing from a distance, but up close, in the interior of a person who has spent years managing what can't be managed, it is one of the most significant shifts that can occur. If something in this landed somewhere real, there may be more worth looking at. The patterns that sit just beneath this one, the ones about why certain people carry so much in the first place, run deep, and understanding them tends to change things.